I think people get really wrapped up on BMI, and I never have. I mean, maybe it's because I've never fit into any of these gosh darn height weight charts. I mean, I'm 6 feet tall, I tend to have more muscle than the average person. I understand what the metric is trying to do, and I understand the limitations of the metric, and I understand that there's a bigger picture here. That being said, I also understand and I'm totally empathetic towards people's frustration if they go to the doctor and all the doctor has is the BMI, and they're like, well, you need to get on diet and exercise, when they don't understand necessarily the context of the whole person. And so I do encourage people who maybe are in that scenario to either just question their doc or present some other information, or maybe just find another doctor who you think better understands interpreting all of the markers of health versus just looking at BMI.
Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. How are you, EC?
Good.
We're focusing on the cutting through the noise part of that little introduction this week. We're going to dive into headlines versus realities, 3 different studies covering topics from multivitamin use for memory in older adults, considering BMI as a health metric, and the potential use of a bodybuilding supplement to prevent Alzheimer's. We're going to dive into that just a minute, but first, just want to invite you, if you are listening to this show, if you've been listening to this show and you appreciate it, you like it, you get value out of EC's insight, the best way you can help us continue to do the show, to continue to make the show, is to share it. Share it with a friend, a colleague, a gym buddy, and just say, hey, I think you might appreciate that. We thank you in advance for doing so.
Yes.
Okay, let's get into this. 3 headlines, 3 realities. I really like this as an idea. Hopefully we can keep doing this. I like this as a little format. But because it's the first time we've done it, give us a little bit of context as to what we're going to do. And then we're going to jump into these 3 headlines that we've got loaded up.
Yeah. Yeah. So I get questions to address on the podcast. I know.
You get questions?
I know.
I get questions for you. That's how many questions you get.
And so I try to answer them in my emails and on social media. And of course, the podcast, we've done quick bite formats and stuff like that. And so people will also, as some of their questions, kind of just send me an article and like, hey, what's your take on this? And so I thought, kind of playing around with the format, hey, instead of just taking it as answer their question, which hopefully I will do, but also kind of tease out this theme of what might be missing when you read something in the lay press versus the study. And so that's how this idea of headlines versus realities, I think we're playing with. But we'll link to all of the news articles as well as the studies in the show notes.
Cool. So this is like a serious version of hotcakes.
Right. Yeah,
hotcakes was kind of like half tongue in cheek. Like, can you just explain this to me? But these are real news stories.
Yeah, they are.
Okay. Cool. Okay. We've got 3 of them. Like I said, we're going to dive right into the first one. The first one is relatively recent in the Washington Post. The title of the article, "Want to Slow Memory Loss After 60? A Multivitamin May Be the Answer." A listener who sent this, Alex, sent along, "Multivitamin for memory in older adults." I know, more supplement questions. This one actually seems like there might be something to it, though. Maybe for the worth a shot TM bucket. Shout out to Alex. Clearly been listening to the show for a while. Worth a shot TM. I think that he continues. I think the title may give it away, but let's review what the article says and a little more background on the study.
Yeah. So the background of the study, they were looking at cognitive function in older adults over 60 years old, and they were given a multivitamin or a placebo. And the one study that this news article was on was kind of part of a 3-part bigger overall studies where they were looking at different aspects of memory, cognitive function, and multivitamin supplementation. And basically across the 3 studies, they found that multivitamins significantly improved global cognition and memory. And it was something like on the order of magnitude that the effect was reducing normal cognitive aging by 2 years. I should note, I don't have access to the full scientific studies, so I could have done a deeper dive on some of this, but from what I can tell, the studies look, quote, pretty good. There's more than 5,000 people in them. Each study was at least 2 years, and they were randomized control trials. So all of the kind of the general stuff that we look for to be able to say, okay, this is a really good conclusion or a really well-researched topic.
Got it. Okay, so we're talking headlines versus realities. So maybe what realities do you think are perhaps missing from the news article itself? So maybe what's the bridge between the headlines and the realities?
Yeah, I think there's kind of 2 issues that I want to tackle. The first is when you read the most recent study, kind of the intro to it, and again, that's in the show notes, you learn in the introduction or the background section of the research paper about prior research. And this is common of intros. They kind of explain where we've been in terms of the research. And they list out a handful of other studies that did not find any benefit of multivitamin supplementation on later in life cognition. And so, I realized how often this is probably true that when you open up a news article about new study finds, does it actually list out for you all the prior research? Not
Mm.
much. It's not like, well, by the way, there were 5 older studies that said nothing.
Hmm.
Instead, partially because of the way the media is, and we just don't have that much length or space for these new articles, but you don't necessarily get the weight of the evidence that's out there. You don't get necessarily the universe that exists about multivitamin supplementation and cognition. So you're sort of left thinking, oh, maybe this is the only study. Maybe this is really the cutting edge thing out there,
Mm.
right? So I think again we have to kind of think about what information that we're not getting. I think we kind of touched on that in the last podcast episodes, but you can maybe look at one study out of the 10 and end up with a different conclusion than if you saw all of them. Okay, so that's one thing. We don't actually learn in the news article that there has been more studies than not that found no effect. The other thing about the studies is I know we just mentioned this with the muscle protein synthesis podcast, but I think it's really important to understand how limited your view of what you should do is based on what the study actually tested.
Hmm.
So we can get into thinking, okay, we now know the best answer, but it's the best answer out of what was tested. And so in this case, we might be left with, oh, multivitamin supplementation is how I fight cognitive decline. But it's actually the conclusion that you should come away with is taking a multivitamin is better than not taking a multivitamin in a standard American diet. Not necessarily that multivitamin supplementation is the most optimal method to prevent cognitive decline. And I think the article actually does a pretty good job with this. Granted, it's in the 10th paragraph or so where they talk about, okay,
Mm.
diet is still important. But what I'm trying to say is if I want to be able to recommend how do I prevent cognitive decline from a diet point of view, I would like this study to show me not just multivitamin versus placebo on standard American diet. Okay, now let's also look at the people that are doing the 800-gram challenge. And then let's add another group who's doing the 800-gram challenge plus regular exercise.
Mm.
I think you could say it's a little bit of speculation, but we do have association studies which show less cognitive decline with higher quality diets. And we actually have talked about that before on one of the podcasts with the Mind Diet. So yeah, I don't have, hard data to say that that's definitely going to be a better effect, but we have some data trending in that direction. And I think, it's easy to, again, to think, okay, well, the best option for me is I should take a multivitamin supplement when you're not thinking, what did they not test? And is that a better option than what they tested?
It doesn't sound like it, but does this study change or color your recommendations around multivitamins at all?
Yeah. I could do again a better, deeper dive looking into the body of evidence here, including the research that they say, didn't have an effect and understand maybe their study was a stronger study and blah, blah, blah. I admittedly did not do a full deep dive into all of the research on multivitamin supplementation and cognitive decline. Um, I will say, I feel like I've said this before, but people might be surprised to hear it again. If my option is somebody eating a standard American diet or a standard American diet with a multivitamin, I'm going to recommend the latter. I'm
Mm.
going to say, yes, I think a standard American diet with a multivitamin is better. I just don't think it's a great option. I just don't think it's a great option for health overall. And so I don't recommend it because why am I going to recommend something that I really don't think has a big effect? And I think again, people see it as, okay, well, I'm taking a multivitamin that's better than nothing. It's a step in the right direction. And I guess you could say it is, but I kind of like this analogy of like, well, let's just say the place that you want to get to in terms of health prevention is 100 steps away. The multivitamin may, in fact, get you that first step. But taking the multivitamin every day doesn't keep advancing your steps forward. It just keeps you on step 1 out of 100, just keeps you there instead of being on step 0. Where if we were to do something like the 800-gram challenge, we're going to get to step 50. And if we do something like regular exercise plus the 800-gram challenge, we might be at 75 or 80. And look, what about
Hmm.
sleep? And what about decreasing life stress? And that's how we really advance to the step 100. And so that's what why I'm not going to recommend these. It's like, I just think, yes, it's better than nothing, but it's such a small step better than nothing that why am I going to be pigeonholed into making that as my recommendation? I just can't. I have to present the option where I think people are really going to see a truly meaningful benefit.
Got it. All right. Let's jump into our second article. This was in the New Scientist, and I think it came out this past summer. And the headline and subhead were "Having an overweight BMI may not lead to an earlier death." A large U.S. study has found that being overweight but not obese carried a slightly lower risk of dying within the study period than being a supposedly healthy weight. And Marusa sent in this article and was basically asking for your take on what to make of the results. So let's start like we did before, maybe just some background on the study and what it entailed.
Yeah. This is the Visaria paper in the show notes, but it's an observation study, so not a randomized control trial, observation study, but it is a pretty big sample size. They were looking at more than 500,000 people. They followed them for about 9 years. That's kind of the median length of time, but some people they actually followed up for 20 years. And they looked at when did they die and then relative to their BMI. So BMI, I'm sure people know, is body mass index, but it's the ratio of your weight to height squared. And you're considered to be a healthy weight when it's less than 25. And having a BMI in the overweight range of 25 to 29.9 was actually associated with a lower risk of death. And what's really kind of interesting there is they broke up the overweight range into two sort of categories. And the people who were in the higher end of the overweight range had the lowest risk of death. And so people who were in the 27.5 to 29.9 had the lowest risk of death over people who were considered normal or healthy weight, as well as people who had a lower weight within the overweight category.
Okay, like we did before, let's maybe dive into the specifics of the headlines versus the realities. Maybe jumping into the realities. What is this study? What is this article actually saying?
Yeah, I do think this article does a pretty good job. Some of the things, of course, they don't admit to are the limitations of the study. How much of a news article is really going to go into that? It's kind of a bit sciencey for people, but again, it's association study. It doesn't prove anything. This was also interesting when I was looking at the scientific study. It was based on self-reported data. So people just told the researchers what their height and weight was. And they also only collected the data once from the participants, even over, let's say, the 9 or even 20 years. So you have to kind of wonder, okay, how accurate is the data? I will also say a limitation of the study is that the risk reductions are relatively small. We're talking about risk reductions about 5 or 7%. So it's certainly not the type of conclusion that you would say, oh, okay, because of this data, I'm now going to target a BMI of 28. It's just not strong enough to say that. But I do think there are two strong messages that the news article really pulls forward. And the first is that we can't evaluate somebody's health based on one metric, which I think our listeners are not surprised to hear. It's never one thing. And really, with BMI, it's not going to be the metric that we want to use to make any real substantive health decisions on. And this article actually points out that last summer, around the time the study came out, but the American Medical Association advised doctors that BMI shouldn't be used in isolation, and they should be using it in conjunction with things like waist circumference and other measures of health, which is, of course, really good to see because that's going to give us the better picture, which is great. The second thing that I think the news article does a really good job of is just questioning the overall utility of BMI and specifically for death risk, because again, that's what the article studied. This is saying, okay, you know what? Maybe BMI isn't the best metric to use to consider mortality risk. And maybe we should use something like body fat distribution or body fat percentage as a better way to estimate that. And I think that's great. I think it's great to kind of point that out and say that it's probably a poor indicator to use. What's interesting about that is we have to catch ourselves when we hear something like, oh, okay, body fat distribution or body fat percentage might be the better metric, we still have to catch ourselves and think, okay, it's still never one thing. that
Mhm.
that even if we get perfect measurements on body fat, and even if we get perfect measurements on, body fat distribution, that we're still going to want that overall picture to understand somebody's health risk and not just sort of make decisions just on body fat percentage.
Okay, given that in isolation, it in and of itself is not a perfect metric. Given that, should we be using it at all, or maybe if so, like how would you recommend we think about look at BMI?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's our strongest metric to use for the reasons that we just sort of mentioned. I don't know. I think people get really wrapped up on BMI, and I never have. I mean, maybe it's because I've never fit into any of these gosh darn height weight charts. I mean, I'm 6 feet tall. I tend to have more muscle than other people. Than the
Yep.
average person.
Yep.
Like, I just have never gotten that upset about height weight charts or even BMI, because it's just like, yeah, I understand what the metric is trying to do, and I understand the limitations of the metric, and I understand that there's a bigger picture here. That being said, I also understand and I'm totally empathetic towards people's frustration if they go to the doctor and all the doctor has is the BMI, and they're like, well, you need to get on diet and exercise, when they don't understand necessarily the context of the whole person. And so I do encourage people who maybe are in that scenario to either just question their doc or present some other information, or maybe just find another doctor who you think better understands interpreting all of the markers of health versus just looking at BMI. I think for the practical day to day, it's more useful for people to not necessarily look at BMI. I think you can kind of see some trends. If your BMI is changing significantly in a certain way, that's certainly something of interest. But I think for most people on a day-to-day level, using body fat percentage or waist circumference is overall going to be much better way to assess. And that's really what I recommend, even for people in my masterclass who want to lose weight. I think sometimes people get really fixated on a weight goal, when it's almost better to think about, what do I want my body composition to be? Am I in a healthy range there? And let the scale fall
Mm.
where it may, or let the BMI fall where it may. And so I like to remind people that where we see health associated with body fat percentages, it's men is 12 to 20% and women is 20 to 30%, which is certainly much higher ranges than what we see on the cover of Muscle and Fitness magazines. But so instead of necessarily worrying about what's my BMI or even what's my goal weight, focusing a little bit more on the body fat percentages and then letting the scale or the BMI fall where it may, I think is a better solution. Now, when I say that, I also have to put this caveat that when I say that, people will then be like, okay, well, what's the most accurate way to measure body
Mhm.
fat percentage? And that's a fine question. But I think we can get a little bit lost in the weeds there too, thinking that the percentages I just said are perfect. They're not. It's biology. There's always a range. There's shades of gray.
Third and final article we've got also came out this summer. The title: Bodybuilding Supplement May Help Stave Off Alzheimer's. And Peter, a listener, was wondering if there is any utility in this supplement.
The study was on HMB, beta hydroxy beta methylbutyrate, which, yes, as
Of
the
course.
headline has said, is a popular supplement in the bodybuilding community. And, these articles drive me a little bit crazy. The opening paragraph, you're told that HMB may help protect memory and reduce plaques, which ultimately helps the progression of Alzheimer's disease, kind of what you just sort of said with the title as well.
Mhm.
Then they go on in the next paragraph to tell you that it's been used by bodybuilders to improve muscle size and strength and performance, but yet it's this regular over-the-counter supplement. It's not a steroid. It's very safe. And then you get a quote from the researcher on how promising it is and how safe it is. Oh, and then finally in paragraph 4, not in the headline, paragraph 4 quotes, studies in mice with Alzheimer's disease have shown that HMB successfully reduces plaque. Okay, so we're talking about a mouse study. Oh, okay. We're talking about a
Not a
mouse
bodybuilding study.
study. We're talking about a mouse study. So, they kind of bury that this hasn't really been a human study. And I think we talked about this in the low protein and longevity episode, that so much of what we find in mice doesn't actually play out in people, in humans. In fact, I think the study that I found basically said that 50% of the results that we see in mice actually happens in human, meaning a flip of a coin that yeah, yeah, it happened in mice, but whether or not it's actually going to also be the same in humans, we don't know. And we rely so much on this idea that we have such similar DNA. It's like 97% of our DNA is the same as a mouse, which is interesting. When you first hear that, you're like, oh my gosh, we're exactly the same. But then you have to take a step back and be like, but we aren't mice.
That 3% is important.
Yeah, that 3% is really important. It turns out there's really big differences between mice and humans, right? So it's very tempting to take a mouse study and be like, okay, this is showing decrease progression of plaques. Let's go ahead and use this for Alzheimer's prevention. But it's just really, really premature. And I'm not saying that the researcher doesn't know that. In fact, there's a quote from the researcher saying, if this is replicated in a human. So I'm 100% positive that the researcher knows that this is a long way off from being a human recommendation. But the news article really buries that scientific information and the context of how premature this is. And so I can totally see someone, on the bus on the way to the work or whatever it is on the metro, and they're just scanning the headlines and they read the headline, they read the first few paragraphs, and then their thought is, maybe I'll pick up some HMB for prevention of Alzheimer's, right? But you really have to get kind of deep into the article to understand, this isn't really that relevant or doesn't really have that evidence right now.
Maybe to wrap up, does it make sense to comment or talk a little bit about the effectiveness of HMB as a supplement used as it is used in the bodybuilding community? What is it like? What does it do? What is it for? Is it effective in and of itself?
Yeah. Why are they using it?
I've never actually heard of it.
Do we need it for all those gains? Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's not in the worth a shot bucket. So I will say that there is some evidence in vitro studies, so kind of cell studies or in animal studies, that HMB might increase MPS. Gosh, we just talked about that. So might increase muscle protein synthesis. But here's a great example of where we don't actually see that translates into performance gains from resistance training. So at this point, while there were some early studies that suggest that it maybe could, hasn't really paid off into the end outcomes that we're looking for. I will add that I did see some research pointing that it helps with muscle strength and mass, particularly in the elderly and when they're sedentary. They've even looked at using it as a supplement for people who have cancer, because sustaining mass while you're going through cancer treatment is one of the top priorities. But as always, I'm not going to take research on a population of sedentary elderly people and then say, okay, this is for my resistance training athletes who want to put on muscle mass, right? So at this point, listeners are not surprised to hear that we're going to keep coming back to keeping the protein high enough, training with intensity enough, sleeping enough, and all of the things that we know for those muscle mass gains.
Love it. All right. Thanks to the folks who sent these along. If you do find a headline that perhaps you've got some questions about, what's the best way to send them to you, EC? The newsletter?
Yeah. Anytime, you just can hit reply on any of the emails I send out and it goes in the queue, which, has not the most amazing organizational system, but we get to them, Patrick. We get to them.
Eventually. We will get to it eventually. Cool. So thank you in advance for folks for sending those along. And hopefully, again, I said this at the top, I really like this as a format because I do think that many, many people, myself included, oftentimes will just stop at the headline. So it's nice to get a little bit deeper, understand the headlines a little bit more. So thank you, EC. Thank you, everybody out there for listening. One more reminder, the best way you can help us continue to do the show and grow the show is to share it with a friend or a cousin or a friend at the gym. So thank you in advance for doing so. And EC and I will be back next week for another episode of the Consistency Project podcast.